Hey everybody, it's Mike and welcome to Chip Damage. And you know what? I love Final Fantasy, and I let it be known. In fact, when I meet someone new, I usually open with that line. And with the recent rise of popularity of the series, with the release of Final Fantasy VII Remake and the upcoming Final Fantasy XVI, I'm starting to hear some questions. I'm getting asked, hey Mike, what are some other good Final Fantasy titles I can jump into? Or, hey, what's a good title to jump into for a first timer? And when I get asked that question, I really tailor the answer depending on the person asking me. I think, does this person like fantasy? Does this person like sci-fi? Do they want a turn-based game? Do they like more action-oriented battle systems? So the answer really can vary. I mean, the series is so vast and old, there really are no wrong answers. So you really have to think about who is asking. And the creators of the series, the producers of the series, Square Enix, have been pretty good with re-releasing their numbered titles throughout the years. However, with all those re-releases comes different versions of the games, and that's kind of what I want to talk about here today. I want to tell you guys what are the best versions of each of the numbered Final Fantasy games. There are many versions. I've come through almost all of them, and I want to tell you which, if you want to jump into one of these games, is the absolute best and most complete version that you can find. You will have to jump through some hoops hardware-wise in order to play some of these versions, but hey, that's part of collecting, and at least you'll know which is the best. So let's jump in, shall we? Let's start with the very first title. That's Final Fantasy I, released all the way back in 1987, and what I'm holding is the best version of this game. That is the PSP version. You can find versions of this game on dozens of consoles. The NES, where it's an 8-bit game, it was re-released on PlayStation, it was re-released on the Game Boy Advance in the 2-pack with Final Fantasy II. However, the PSP release of 2007, released for the game's 20th anniversary, is the absolute most complete version. So if you have a PSP around, laying around, you can definitely find copies of this game. It is not hard to find. This version of the game has fantastic sprites. This game has all the bonuses from those prior set versions. The PS1 version added some cutscenes to the beginning and end of the game. The Game Boy Advance version added some bonus dungeons. Those are included in this game. And it has a secret boss and exclusive dungeon in this version that isn't found anywhere else. I recently went through this version myself and I loved it. However, I must warn you, this is an older RPG. This was a game released in a time where you were supposed to draw maps and take notes and spend a lot of time playing a single game. So I strongly suggest that you use a guide. There was a guide made for this version of the game, and of course you can find them online. And you really want that, or you're going to end up wandering around trying to figure out what to do next, because that was the thing to do in the era that this game was made. As far as story goes, very simple. You play as 4 warriors of light, or knights, who need to go out and stop an encroaching evil, save the princess, save the world. Like I said, older RPG, not much in the story category, but a great start. Classic turn-based battles, no tricks. This is the start of the series after all, and this is a great version to start with if you're looking to get into turn-based RPGs. But yet again, make sure you get a guide. So moving on to the 1988 release of Final Fantasy II. Yet again, I'm holding the PSP version here. As you can see, this is yet again the best version of this game. It was released on PS1, PlayStation 3 Digital Store, the Game Boy Advance, just like the release of the first game. This game is, I'd say, my least favorite of the Final Fantasy series. I wouldn't say outright bad, but it has a tendency to be pretty boring. This game was experimental. So the progression system is not like in most RPGs, at least most JRPGs. It's actually more akin to the Elder Scrolls series, if you're familiar with that. The more you do in action, the better you get at it. And that sounds pretty good, but it's very easy to break, and you can end up neglecting certain skills and overpowering others. As far as story goes, simple story, a little bit more in depth than the first title. You play as a character named Firion, who must stop an evil empire with an emperor who has summoned an army of demons to take over the world with your ragtag bunch of misfits. Basic RPG stuff, a little bit more in depth. I prefer named and voiced characters like Firion as opposed to the voiceless and nameless Warrior of Light. When I say voiced, I mean text boxes. Of course, this is long before any voice acting in games. And yet again, like Final Fantasy I, This has exclusive cutscenes from the PS1 version included, dungeons from the Game Boy Advance version included, as well as exclusive bosses and dungeons only found in the PSP versions. So yeah, Final Fantasy 1 and 2, you want the PSP versions for sure. Now we're moving on to the 1990 release of Final Fantasy III, and this is an odd one in the series. So the original Nintendo version, or NES version, was never released in North America. We had to wait until 2006 to get a completely remade Nintendo DS version, and that's one of the versions I would suggest to play. Like Final Fantasy I, for the most part, your character is voiceless. There are a few lines in this DS version thrown in there. You play as a character named Lunith and his party, stopping a cloud of darkness and evil wizards, saving crystals of wind, of fire, earth, and water, reigniting them. Yet again, very simple fantasy affair. It's still 1990. This is the premiere version. This is actually a 3D RPG as opposed to the original 8-bit version. The game was given a 3D facelift on the DS with chibi characters. The maps weren't exactly changed, but brought to life, and it's a pretty appealing look. I do like this version of the game. This was also re-released on the PlayStation Vita as a downloadable title. It's nearly identical to this DS version, so whether you have a DS, you can pick up this version, or you can download this version on the PlayStation Vita. Either way, those are your best and really your only options. This game does not need a guide as much as its prior titles, the prior titles of 1 and 2, so you can just kind of pick up and play this simple, fun, good RPG, DS and PS Vita. So Final Fantasy III. All right, now we're moving on to one of the more complicated titles to talk about the best versions, because there are so many versions of this, and that is Final Fantasy IV, as you can see. Now I'm holding two versions here, the PSP version and the Nintendo DS version. This game was originally released on the Super Nintendo and re-released on the PlayStation 1, PlayStation downloadable network. However, these two versions are the ones you kind of want to go for, but this is really up to your preference. The PSP version is a beautiful recreation of the Super Nintendo version with fantastic sprites, bonus dungeons, the bonus cutscenes from the PS1 version, as well as 2 extra games included. It has Final Fantasy IV: The After Years, which was a sequel game made years after Final Fantasy IV on the Nintendo Wii as an episodic title. Yeah, it was a bizarre thing. They released a sequel to a 16-bit RPG on the Wii as an episodic title. As many of you know, the Nintendo Wii is no longer online, so you can no longer get that version. But you can still get a physical version of it if you get it here in the PSP version. And exclusive to this collection is something called Final Fantasy IV Interlude, which connects the original game and the After Years. That's only found on this collection. Like I said, this is 16-bit sprites at its finest. Square did a really good job at sharpening them up and making them look great. And this is my preferred version of the game. However, the Final Fantasy IV on the DS is very different. So it is the same story. It lacks the interlude and the after years. However, it is 3D in the way that Final Fantasy 3DS was 3D. Chibi style, upgraded visuals with full voice acting. And this game does have a full proper story. This is, at the time, this was the most advanced Final Fantasy story told. It's a story about a character named Cecil and his betrayal to his kingdom. His family gets involved. He has a very interesting lineage. There may or may not be aliens involved in the game. It's a hell of a story. It's one of the more revered stories in the series. However, which version you should play really comes down to whether you want the sharpest 2D sprites that you can find on a handheld, or if you want a 3D title with voice acting. I prefer the PSP one just because of the beauty of those sprites and because I liked the interlude and after years included, but that's up to you. So I'd say 60% of me wants to say Final Fantasy IV and PSP, the other 40 on the DS. However, both excellent games, whatever you go with, you're going to enjoy this one. This is where Final Fantasy really started to stick out. So Final Fantasy IV, DS or PSP. All right, now another title that's a little difficult to talk about. Unfortunately, Final Fantasy V, as you can see here, I have on the Game Boy Advance. I was unable to find the case and manual for this game. It is somewhat hard to find, but this is probably the version that you'd want to play. So if you have a Nintendo DS or Game Boy Advance or Game Boy Advance SP, you can get Final Fantasy V on this. This was also released on the Super Nintendo back in 1991, and the PlayStation 1, and those versions do, the PlayStation 1 version at the very least has bonus cutscenes and a few graphical touches. However, the Game Boy Advance version is a larger version of the game. It has more dungeons, more enemy types, new bosses, and that's only found here on the Game Boy Advance version. Unfortunately, it does not have the exclusive cutscenes from the PS1 version, but in terms of gameplay, this is definitely the version you want to go for. It doesn't have quite as sharp color as that PS1 version. Being on a handheld, being on a small screen, it's not quite as sharp. But however, it loads faster than that PS1 version. Yeah, the PS1 version has load times. So overall, I'd say if you can hunt this down, it is slightly hard to find the Game Boy Advance version. I would go for it. So Final Fantasy V on the Game Boy Advance. As a quick overview of the story, not too much in this one. You play as a boy named Bart going around reviving the crystals, the wind crystal as it were. It's always crystals in the early Final Fantasy games that are a main point in the story. You end up fighting the various evils throughout the world, maybe a tree. I don't want to go into spoilers too much, but yeah, Final Fantasy V, not the best on story, but a hell of a fun game nonetheless, and the best version is on the Game Boy Advance. Okay, so now we're going into a fan favorite and my favorite 2D entry of the series. That's Final Fantasy VI. As you can see here, I was not able to find the box for this one, just like with Final Fantasy V, but I was at least able to find the manual. I'm working on getting the box. I'm also going to bring up the PlayStation version of this, which is found on the Final Fantasy Anthology, which is a collection of 5 and 6 on the PS1. And yet again, this one's a little hard to call, but I'm going to have to give it to the Final Fantasy VI on the Game Boy Advance. So the Final Fantasy VI on the PS1 looks a little sharper, and yet again, it has opening and ending cutscenes that are only found on this version. However, yet again, it has load times, and every time you go in and out of a building or across the screen, it loads, and that adds up in a game that could be this long. It's about a 30 or 40-hour game. The Game Boy Advance does not have those load times. It does not have those opening and ending cutscenes, but however, you do get exclusive bosses, exclusive content, a rewritten script, and 4 exclusive summons. I believe the summons are Leviathan, Cactar, Gilgamesh, and Diablos. And those are cool summons. Summons are a huge part of this game's gameplay system and the story. So having more summons, to me, is better than a few cutscenes at the beginning and end of a game that weren't originally there on its Super Nintendo version, which was released in 1994, by the way. So yeah, this is rare. This was released very late in the Game Boy Advance life. It's in 2007, well after the DS came out. So this is very collectible, but this is the version you want to get if you want the best version of Final Fantasy VI. There's nothing wrong with that PlayStation 1 version. That is much easier to find. So if you can't get your hands on the Game Boy Advance version, all you're missing out is on 4 summons. That's not a deal breaker. However, if you have the option, spring the extra money, try to get the Game Boy Advance version. Final Fantasy VI. Fantastic game. Right up tied for my second favorite Final Fantasy. We'll get into what's my first in a little bit. But yeah, Final Fantasy VI, Game Boy Advance. All right. And now, of course, we're getting into the Final Fantasy that needs no introduction, Final Fantasy VII. So, yeah, I'm one of those people. This is my favorite one. Maybe not for reasons that most other people claim. I love this game is just brimming with heart. Yeah, you play as little Lego people, but with those little Lego people, the creators were really able to convey a great story, a lot of heart, a lot of character, and to me, the greatest soundtrack in Final Fantasies found here. All Final Fantasies have great music. Let me be clear about that. But there are certain tracks in this game that bring tears to my eye. So let's talk about the game itself, the versions of the game, as it were. Of course, this is the PS1 version. This was re-released on every modern console, the Xbox One, the PS4, and the Nintendo Switch. So that version is based on the PC version of the original game. And that's the version I would play, the downloadable version, the PS4 or Nintendo Switch version, or the Xbox One version. It is essentially the same game as the original PS1. However, there are, I'd say, dip switches or cheats that you can automatically turn on or off at your leisure to expedite the process. This game has random encounters, as most Final Fantasies do. You can turn those on and off, so if you just kind of want to breeze through the game, you can. You can speed up the game to 3 times normal speed. So if you want to, yet again, cut across a field or get through a battle or an animation quicker, you can turn that on and off. You can make yourself invincible in the game. So if you just want to play it for the story, you can blow right through all the enemies and bosses. Yet again, that is found in the downloadable version on the PS4, Xbox One, and Switch. And between those two versions, it's a matter of preference. I'm a trophy hunter. I love getting platinum trophies, so I opted for the PlayStation 4 version. But if that's not important to you and you want portability, the Nintendo Switch version is essentially the same. So yeah, Final Fantasy VII on the modern downloadable consoles, that's fine. However, I do want to take a step aside here from our conversation to mention the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now, that is very popular now, and it is slightly controversial, a little polarizing, but I'd say it's definitely more on the positive side of the world right now. I'm on that positive side. I love the Final Fantasy VII Remake. I know it's divisive, but I love the things they did to it, and I cannot wait for the next one. In fact, for those of you who have played it, the moment that you get off the train in the slums under Midgar in the remake and you look up and you see the plate, that was my gaming moment of 2020. No doubt. That brought a tear to my eye. I just stared at the bottom of that plate for a good 10 minutes before I moved on. But getting back to my statement, whether you should play this before remake or after, if you should bother with the original, I must say I do think you'll get more out of this remake if you play the original. I won't go into detail, but I do think that people who are aware of the original script and story of Final Fantasy VII will enjoy Remake more. Now, if you don't want to go through a 50-hour classic RPG as an old RPG with older visuals and older gameplay styles before you jump into your brand new PS4 or PS5 to play Final Fantasy VII Remake, I understand you're still going to get an amazing game experience. Remake stands on its own as a fantastic game. However, if you want that little bit of extra magic, if you want a little bit more out of it, I do suggest you play both and that you play the original first. But hey, maybe you'll like Remake and go back and play the original. Either way, I suggest you play both. All right, let's move on. Of course, we're looking at a divisive title in the series, Final Fantasy VIII. I first played this fairly recently, actually, and I enjoyed it. The version I played, which is the preferred version of the game, is the Final Fantasy VIII Remastered that is also on the Nintendo Switch, Xbox One, and PS4. What you're seeing in front of you is, of course, the original PlayStation 1 version, and it has all the same benefits of Final Fantasy VII that I said earlier. You can speed the game up, you can turn random encounters off, you can make yourself invincible. However, those benefits are far better in Final Fantasy VIII than they would be in 7 because Final Fantasy VIII has a few stigmas attached to it. Number one, all the enemies of the world level up with you, so there's no point in grinding. So if you were to just turn off all random encounters and blow through the game, you're really not missing out on much. The game doesn't get easier or harder depending on what you do. Also, one thing that I did not like about this game is the grind. There is a system where you need to defeat enemies in what's called the draw system to draw in their magical power, to power yourselves up, to power your spells up. That is a long and tedious process, and that 3 times speed option definitely comes in handy. And just as a note on this game, like I said, divisive. I enjoyed it. I think the first half of the game is far better than the latter half of the game. I enjoyed the characters. I don't think they're the best characters in Final Fantasy history. I don't think they hold a candle to the more, how should I say, outlandish characters in FF7. But it is in the vein of Final Fantasy VII, as in being a more cyberpunk anime, almost Akira-inspired game. Like its predecessor. So it's good. It's worth checking out. And if you're going to get it, definitely download the PS4, Xbox One, or Nintendo Switch version. So yeah, Final Fantasy VIII. Pretty good game. Not my favorite. But with this next game is one of my favorites and many people's favorites. And that is Final Fantasy IX, originally released back in 2000 on the PlayStation 1. A very late PlayStation 1 game. And you can tell when you look at this because this game looks pretty impressive for the console it was released on. Fantastic character models and pre-rendered backgrounds. And like with the prior 2 games, this was released on PS4, on Xbox One, on Switch, with the enhancements I mentioned, 3 times speed, turn enemy encounters off, and invincibility. And I fully suggest you play that version. Some people take umbrage with this version of the game, the one I'm speaking of, the downloadable version, because of the imprecision of the D-pad. The original PlayStation had a 8-way movement option with its stick, and that doesn't translate too well to modern systems. But it's really not important. It's really, in my case at least, not an issue. So yeah, definitely download this game. It is one of the most heartfelt games I have ever played. This game's music can bring a tear to my eye. Final Fantasy IX is a fantastic game to start with. If you have played other games in the title in the series and have not played this title, I don't know what your problem is. You really need to play Final Fantasy IX. It is probably my third favorite game in the series and one I would recommend to many newcomers who don't mind a little bit of that, jank found in older games. It is a little bit of a slower game, but man, it bleeds heart and soul. So yeah, Final Fantasy IX, PS4, Xbox One, and Switch. Great version. All right, now we're getting into a new era of Final Fantasy. What was originally released on PlayStation 2 is Final Fantasy X. And yeah, this is kind of tied for my second favorite Final Fantasy with Final Fantasy VI. This was released in 2001 on the PS2, like I said, and it's been re-released many times. You can download this on the PlayStation Vita, you can get it on the PS3, but the version I would strongly suggest is the PlayStation 4 version, which is the version you're seeing here. So the deal with the PlayStation 4 version is it has all the enhancements of an HD conversion that were originally found in the PlayStation 3 version. However, it looks and loads even better. And the PlayStation 3 version only had a remastered soundtrack, a different soundtrack than its original PS2 version. This version actually allows you to switch whether you like the original 2001 arrangement or if you like the PlayStation 3 arrangement. And that's nice. If you're going to have a collection, go all out. Add all the bells and whistles. And this version certainly does. As you can see, it also includes the direct sequel to Final Fantasy X, Final Fantasy X-2. Please don't say X2. I hate when people say X2. It's a weird tick. I'm sorry. I am a nerd. It is X-2. But yeah, PlayStation 4 version of Final Fantasy X. Yet again, this is actually a pretty good game to start with. I know a lot of people who did start with this game, and it's a traditional turn-based battle system, a weird leveling up system called the Severe Grid, which I don't have enough time to fully describe. It takes about an hour to get used to, but once you do get used to it, you'll love it. So yeah, PlayStation 4 version. I'm just going to flex a little bit and show that there was a limited edition version of the PS4 version released. It came with a calendar. That calendar has tons of art from the series artist Yoshitaka Amano, which is really nice. So I think the calendar is from like 2008 or 2018, but the artwork is worth getting it for. So yeah, Final Fantasy X on the PS4. If you can get the collector's edition or the limited edition as I'm showing here, it's worth getting just for that art. So all right, so the next game in the series was Final Fantasy XI, which I'm actually not going to be going over in depth right now because that was an online MMO that I have dabbled in but never gotten into deeply. That game, obviously, if you're going to play an MMO, you want to play that on the PC. There was a PS2 and Xbox 360 version, but it's an MMO. You want it on the PC. I will go over Final Fantasy XI in another video in the future, so please look forward to that. But pretty simple answer here. If you're going to go back and play that MMO, you're going to want to play it on your PC. All right, now we're getting into Final Fantasy XII, which was originally released on the PlayStation 2 back in 2006. And this is not one of my favorite titles in the game. This one is kind of openly loved. A lot of people have expressed their interest of this game, their love of this game to me, and I'm just not one of them. I think it's a good game, but I don't know what it is about this one. This game has a much less anime aesthetic than the prior titles. Maybe that's it. This game has its setting based on Turkey, the country of Turkey, which I wasn't a huge fan. This game had a troubled development. I believe the director stepped down. I believe members of the team passed away while working on this game. So you can kind of feel some odd story choices and cuts throughout the game. But overall, it's still a good RPG. I just don't think it's a great Final Fantasy. I think it's my second least favorite after Final Fantasy II, which is definitely my least favorite. But anyway, as far as versions go, the PlayStation 2 version is one you should avoid because it was much enhanced later with Final Fantasy XII, the Zodiac Age, which I'm holding here. This version added New Game Plus features, the ability to rearrange your character's stats and jobs on the fly. However, in a strange twist of fate, the PlayStation 4 version of the Zodiac Age is not the best version. What I'm not showing here, because I don't have it yet, is the Xbox One version of Final Fantasy XII, the Zodiac Age. Yes, the Xbox version of Final Fantasy XII is the best for one reason. It was released a little bit later than the PS4 version with a few extra bells and whistles in terms of features. One of those features being the ability to carry all of your equipment into a new game plus file. As in, when you beat the game, you can start a new game, a new file with all your equipment from the previous save. Now, while some of the additions were patched into the PlayStation 4 version, that particular feature was not. So, yeah, the Xbox One version is the version you want to get if you want the most complete and best version of Final Fantasy XII. Also, if you happen to have an Xbox One X or Series X, the game runs at 60 frames. As a side note, the Switch version, which isn't quite as pretty, also has those Xbox One features, so you can go with that if you're looking for portability. Now, as a side note, instead of a 3x speed feature as found in 7, 8, and 9 remasters, the Final Fantasy XII has a 4x speed modifier, which really lets you blow through that game and grind and get real strong real quick. So keep that in mind when getting it. But yeah, Xbox One version of Final Fantasy XII. That's the version to get. Okay, now we are getting into what is easily the most derided, divisive title in the Final Fantasy franchise, and that is Final Fantasy XIII. Now, lynch me if you must. I like this game. I don't love it. It's not my favorite Final Fantasy. It's somewhere in the middle. But the complaints it levied against this game are a little nonsensical to me. Yeah, the characters are a little shallow. The story is a little boring. And it is a little linear, but I always had a sense in Final Fantasy games that they're all pretty linear, especially like Final Fantasy X, giving you the illusion of an open world. I mean, if you step out of bounds in most Final Fantasy games, you're going to be killed by strong enemies pretty quickly, so you'd have to grind to kind of go off the beaten path. And that's not really a thing in Final Fantasy XIII. For most of the game, you do kind of just go forward and fight. However, fighting is excellent in this game. I actually really enjoy the combat system. It's fast, it's flashy. The soundtrack is unbelievable. I've heard this soundtrack performed live at an orchestra, and it's a real highlight. So don't sleep on that. But getting over that and getting to the versions of the game. So the Xbox 360 and the PS3 were the home consoles of this game, and what you see me holding here is obviously the Xbox 360 version. And just as a note, this is a 3-disc game. On the 360, it was a 1-disc Blu-ray on the PS3 version, but it was 3 discs on the 360. So make sure you get all 3 discs if you get this game secondhand. And originally, I would say that the PlayStation 3 version far outstripped the 360 version. It looked a little sharper, and it was on 1 disc, so you didn't have to get up. However, with the miracle of backwards compatibility, the Xbox One X version of this game is just better than any prior version yet. So if you get the Xbox 360 version and you pop it into your Xbox One X, you're going to get a gorgeous game. Say what you will about Final Fantasy XIII, it had some very pretty visuals, very shiny, very flashy, and those are really accentuated on the Xbox One X version. So yeah, if you have that option, if you have an Xbox One X and you want to play Final Fantasy XIII, go ahead, you're going to be playing the best version. There's actually a very great video on Digital Foundry, the YouTube channel that examines graphics about those version differences, and it is very clear that the Xbox One X version of this game is the best. And by the way, if you started this, didn't like it, put it down and have heard it, or if you haven't ever played this but you kind of avoided it because you heard it's bad, give it a shot. It's a solid game. It's actually pretty simple too in a lot of ways, so it is a good game to begin with. Just for that soundtrack and that battle system, check it out, Final Fantasy XIII. Lynch me if you must, but I don't think it's that bad. All right, so with Final Fantasy XIV, I'm going to give pretty much the same answer I did with Final Fantasy XI. That is an MMO, a much more modern MMO that was originally released on PS3. It's on PS4. It is coming to PS5. However, of course, if you have a high-end PC, that's the way to play that game. I don't have much experience with Final Fantasy XIV. I intend to go into it more and talk about it in a future video, so please look forward to that. But if you're playing an online MMO, consoles are a fine option these days, but of course, PCs can always push it above and beyond. So we're going to move right on to Final Fantasy XV, the most recent numbered title. Now, right off the bat, yet again, this game was slightly divisive. I have my complaints. That my chief complaint about this game is that you need a lot of outside material to enjoy it. You need to watch the prequel movie Kingsglaive. Like, you really need to watch that movie that is not included with base versions of the game to understand the story of this game. There is a limited anime series that fills in the background elements of the characters in the world. Like, there was so much tertiary material around this game to enjoy it fully and properly, that I can definitely see that as a negative point. However, I did watch those movies. I did watch that anime, and I fully enjoyed the game. I like the theme of this game, which is it's good to have bros. Like, that's a good lesson. Hey, you know, it is good to have bros. I have a few bros. They're great. So, not bros in that negative sense. I mean, like brothers, good friends. So, Final Fantasy XV, as far as versions go, this is one of the most modern versions, and you can find this game on the PS4 and the Xbox One, and of course they are backwards compatible on the PS5 and the Xbox Series X. That would be the best way to play it, the prettiest, unless you have a high-end PC, a very high-end PC to run this game. That's obviously the best, but as far as consoles go, Xbox Series X or PS5 backwards compatibility, it shortens the loading times, it sharpens up the game in general. The game has a tendency to look a little funny. You can kind of like see the engine when playing the game. It kind of jitters, but on the newer hardware it looks a little better. There was a version of this called the Royal Edition released about a year and a half after the original release, which includes much of, but not all, of the DLC. So I originally purchased the version you see in front of you. This is the base version. I just purchased the DLC, so I had no need of the Royal Edition. But if you're going to get this game today, get that Royal Edition. There's quite a lot of DLC, and I mean a real lot of DLC for this game, for a single-player game especially. So look for the Final Fantasy XV Royal Edition on your modern console of choice. Great game, worth checking out. Noctis is in Tekken 7. How weird is that? The main character Noctis. So yeah, Final Fantasy branching out. And yeah, that does it for all the modern numbered Final Fantasy titles and their best versions. However, I have one bonus game I want to talk about, and that is Lost Odyssey. Some of you are probably aware of this game, especially you Xbox 360 owners. So the reason I bring this up is that one of the founders of the Final Fantasy series, Hironobu Sakaguchi, left Square Enix, formed his own company called Mistwalker, and made this game around 2008-2009. This is an Xbox 360 exclusive that is just wonderful. This plays like a traditional Final Fantasy turn-based. It feels like a traditional Final Fantasy. It has music like a Final Fantasy. Its name is Lost Odyssey. The title is almost an allusion to Final Fantasy. This game I couldn't recommend enough, especially if you have an Xbox One or One X or Series X laying around. It is backwards compatible. This game I consider a mainline Final Fantasy in a way because of its similarities, because of its heritage. If you can play this game on any system, whether it be 360 or the enhanced version on the Xbox One X or Series X, please check this out if you're a Final Fantasy fan. In fact, I would recommend this over a good number of Final Fantasies as your first game. And as a collector's note, keep in mind, this is a 4-disc game. So you have the 3 discs on the one side here on like a large disc spool. And yeah, it actually came in a disc package like this. The 4th disc is actually like in a side package like this. This isn't the original one, obviously, but it was one similar to this. So yeah, make sure you get all the discs for this game if you decide to go and pick it up. But yeah, bonus game, Lost Odyssey. And that wraps up our talk on all the versions of Final Fantasy. Now, Square has really done a number on these games, and unfortunately, like I said, you do have to jump through some hoops and buy a lot of hardware and go through some financial issues in order to play the best versions of all these games. But until Square Enix more concisely releases all of their titles, that is unfortunately what you're going to have to do. However, I am sure that as time goes on, these titles will continue to be re-released on newer hardware, and I think they should. I think newer gamers and the next generation really should have a chance to play these games. They're fantastic and they're legendary, and I'll go into why in future videos in depth and talk more about each game individually because they really do deserve that. So please look forward to those videos in the future. Thank you for watching this today. My name is Mike, this is Chip Damage, and take care of yourself. Good night.